readers or our viewers or our listeners at all times. That's not the case at all. But if you're not ready on some level for the tragedies of history, they're coming to get you. They'll come and get you right between the eyes. And maybe, just maybe, you can be a little better prepared for that if you've read the right Shakespeare or the right Baldwin or the right... One of my favorite writers is actually a Tennessean, of course, Robert Penn Warren.
You alluded to the way in which so many of the early rectors, presidents, leaders of Yale were Christian ministers and slaveholders. How do you see this sort of mixed legacy of Christianity with regard to slavery and white supremacy?
Well, most of the early justifications for slavery in the empires that engaged, let's just talk about slavery in the Atlantic and then in the European empires of the New World. Slavery has existed in every civilization since time immemorial on all continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, without a doubt. But let's just start with these empires, these Christian empires. Usually the justifications for the slave trade early on, and then the justifications for slavery in the Americas, had a deep Christian, at least veneer. This was in the service of God. It was in the service of the gospel. You know, the idea that they were liberating Africans from barbarity in Africa and giving them a new beginning in a new world was always a kind of popular idea, although there were plenty of people who saw through that, especially some of the slave ship captains who had managed a lot of death. And then early on, if you get to this story of a place like Yale or anywhere else like it in the 18th century, you have to get inside of Puritanism. That's the Calvinist vision of sinners and saints. We're all sinners, but most of us are not saints. And that some people were conditioned for labor, conditioned to serve, and some were conditioned to be educated, enlightened, and lead. Those are very old ideas. They have sometimes attached to ethnicity, nationality, region, family, and so on, and not to race, but by the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, slavery in the Americas became racial slavery. And then it becomes both a kind of Christian destiny, that some people are meant to be enslaved and some as the owners, masters. But it also becomes eventually an economic story. It becomes a story of these great mercantile empires who were building whole new civilizations, creating world commerce. And you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody in 1730s Connecticut, except the enslaved people themselves and many of the indentured servants, who wouldn't have argued that some kind of bound labor wasn't absolutely necessary to this still relatively frontier setting of these colonies. Even more so in the South. How do you develop money crop agriculture? They, of course, eventually argued you have to have large labor forces. And the labor force for American plantation agriculture, of course, for the first near century was mostly indentured labor, which tended to be Europeans, although there were some Africans who were also indentured, and Indians who were indentured. But eventually it's racial slavery that replaces the diminishing supply of indentured servitude. And hence you have this historical collision, this historical nexus. It's an extraordinary story of the economic power of these empires, eventually of the United States, that comes out of one of those empires, and the development of racialized bound labor. One of the best things ever written on this complicated origin story is by the great historian who spent most of his life here at Yale, Ed Morgan. In his book called American Slavery, American Freedom, among other things, he shows that a lot of the answer to that great paradox of how a bunch of American Virginians in particular could create a republic, could have the genius to fashion the American Constitution and lead a revolution against monarchy in the service of liberty, and even mouth the word equality, is because they had come to believe deeply in their souls that all successful societies had to have a dependent labor force, especially an agricultural society. And how better to develop and sustain and control that labor force than to have it be racialized, where it was both visually and somehow culturally understood that labor was now black or racialized, especially in the South. Well, that's true up here too, in Connecticut. It has so much to do with helping us understand that what always seems a paradox, and it is a paradox, to Americans. How could we have created this amazing new republic out of a revolution against monarchy, win a war against a great empire, fashion the U.S. Constitution, despite its compromises and its flaws, was an amazing creation. How could that new republic devoted to liberty also have one of the largest slave systems in the world? Well, it isn't just moral failure. It came out of this deep connections between religious and cultural worldviews and the economics of empire and the economics of growth on a continent that seemed to have limitless expansion, especially if the native peoples could be contained, sustained, or removed. Again, history is full of incredible complexity, and our job is always to boil all that down to a story people can grasp. But this paradox is fundamental to understanding America. We've been built out of contradictions. Frederick Douglass once said that. He said, America is its contradictions. It is all made up of its contradictions. And he would know because he both loved the Declaration of Independence. It was almost like a Bible to him. He just hated the practices of the principles. He thought the principles were fine. And it's all there in his famous 4th of July speech of 1852, where he takes the founders' principles to task, but says the principles are fine. It's our practices that are so full of hypocrisy and danger.
Very briefly, as we close, you're in your mid-70s. You've had a storied, successful career as an academic, Ivy League academic, and yet you're still going strong. You're still going hard. Why not go golfing? And what is keeping you going?
I feel a responsibility to my profession, to this craft we call history and teaching. It's what I've always done. I deeply resent the attacks and the essence of what we do, and I'm going to fight back as long as I can, whether it's in yet another op-ed that doesn't do any good, or a podcast like yours that may.
I've been talking to Professor David Blight, foremost historian of American slavery, serves as a professor of history at Yale. David, thank you so much for your time and your wonderful work in the world. We're grateful to be with you today.
Thank you, Leah. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you very much.
I just found that interesting.